Okay, so everybody's loading in right now. We'll start on time. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm Howard Lovey, Hub Marketing Coordinator for 70 Faces Media, and it's a pleasure to have you all here. The discussion is called Making Hebrew Sing, How Translation Gives New Voice to Israeli Writers. And I'm very excited about this one as an avid reader and writer, and I'm especially excited about our presenters. Joining us today is Jessica Cohen, a British Israeli American literary translator. A recent JTA article, which I'll link to in the chat box, called her the most in-demand Hebrew to English translator working today. And over the past 25 years, she has translated more than 30 books and dozens of shorter works by some of the most renowned Israeli writers. In 2017, she shared the Man Booker International Prize with David Grossman for A Horse Walks into a Bar, and 4 years later, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. And we're also joined by Gal Beckerman, author of When They Come for Us, We'll Be Gone, which was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award and named a Best Book of the Year by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. He's senior editor for books at The Atlantic and is the former editor at the New York Times Book Review. Thank you both for being here, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Howard. And thank you, Jessica. It's such a treat to be able to have a conversation with you because you're someone whose work I've been enjoying for years and years and years. Howard went through the list, but just to emphasize here, we're talking about almost every major Israeli writer over the last 10 years, 10, 15, 20 years. David Grossman, Amos Oz, Etgar Keret, Ronit Matalon, Nir Baram, Rutu Modan, and Tom Segev. I could go on and on. And these are the writers who have sort of shaped English speakers' relationship with Israel in a big way. And so your responsibility and the skill that you bring to the task is pretty incredible. And I don't think it's an understatement to say you're the preeminent Hebrew translator for our times. So anyways, it's really a pleasure to get to talk to you. Because
well, thank you. I just want to say thanks, and it's really nice to be here with all of you, so many people, and thanks to you, Gal. So.
Yeah. So I thought we'd start just because I think most people would probably have some curiosity as to how one becomes a translator. I'm sure it's not something that, or maybe it is, you can tell me otherwise, but I don't imagine that it's something that one sets out to do at the beginning of their life. So tell us a little bit about your sort of origin story as a translator and and your relationship with Hebrew, I guess, really is part of this question as well.
Yeah, it's true. I think, well, especially for kind of my generation and above, very few translators who I know sort of grew up thinking, oh, I'm going to be a translator when I grow up. And then they went to study it and became a translator. That's very seldom the path. Now there are much more translation programs, and I think there's more awareness of translation as a profession. So a lot of younger translators who I meet have had that path where they very intentionally decide this is what I'm going to do. For me personally, even though in retrospect, I see how this is what I was always supposed to do, I didn't have that awareness, starting out. I grew up bilingually. I was born in England, moved to Israel with my family when I was about 7. And so from 7 onwards, I was bilingual. I went to, regular Israeli Hebrew-speaking schools, spoke English and read English at home, which I think emphasis on the reading, because I think that's something that really reinforced my writing skills in English, is of course reading a lot. In fact, I really disliked reading Hebrew growing up because even though I spoke it very fluently, reading was a bit slower and more challenging. And so I would even read some Hebrew literature that I needed for school. If it was translated into English, I would read it in English. That's how big my resistance to reading in Hebrew was. But I did eventually turn that around. And the short version of the story of how I became a translator is that I moved to the US after I finished my undergraduate degree in Jerusalem, which I did in English literature. Came to the States and by a strange turn of events, found myself working at Microsoft in Seattle doing software translation, localization it's called, so very technical stuff, just because they needed someone who knew Hebrew. And so that was my first sort of formal experience translating. And then later on, I basically built up a freelance translation business, again, doing pretty technical things, business, personal documents, all kinds of stuff, from Hebrew to English and English to Hebrew. And literary translation was something I started off doing kind of as a hobby. I just, enjoyed reading new writing that was coming out of Israel and started playing around with translating it. Ended up going back to grad school where I got a certificate in literary translation and took some workshops and was mentored by a professor of translation then. And so that's when I kind of started thinking, I think this is actually what I want to do. And for many years, I kept doing commercial technical translation because that's what paid the bills, basically.
Right.
But I did more and more of the literary stuff. And right when I started out, I was lucky enough to make contact with Deborah Harris, who's a literary agent who represents David Grossman and many, many other fantastic Israeli authors.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my break. Is she asked me to send her some samples, which I did. And quite a lot of the works that I've translated have been through her agency. So that's fortuitous connection.
So what was the shift from sort of translating more technical, which I imagine was almost a more literal translation, if such a thing could be said, to the literary realm?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously there's a lot less creativity involved. And in fact, if you're too creative or too original, then you're not doing a good job.
Right.
If you're translating an apartment lease or an instruction manual. But I do think that experience has served me in the sense of being aware of translation as a profession. And I think, there is actually, we're lacking some professionalization of literary translation because, yes, it is artistic and it is creative, and it's something that almost everyone who does it loves it, right? We none of us go into literary translation to make a lot of money. It is a labor of love, but we also are professionals, and this is our job. So having that background of working with translation agencies, working with deadlines, needing to be very careful about being accurate and comparing, the translation to the original over and over again, that kind of thing, I think I picked up quite a bit from commercial translation. And some people who come perhaps from writing or academia or other kinds of writing don't necessarily have that foundation.
Did you, because you talked about having this sort of early exposure to Hebrew as a young person, and do you have feelings about the language? I mean, was it like if you had grown up in Italy, and had that facility in both languages, you might have been an Italian translator, or was there something particularly sort of challenging or interesting or sort of engaging to you about Hebrew as a language to work from?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I can answer it because it's so hypothetical. I would imagine that, had we immigrated to Italy or Sweden, I would have chosen those languages, perhaps. Right. I mean, I like to I think that many of us, people who have anything to do with Israel or Judaism or Hebrew, feel somehow instinctively that there is this bond that is perhaps stronger than some other languages. But really, I imagine that's probably not true, right? Everyone has an emotional connection to the language that they grew up in or that they had some kind of formative experience in. And that's the way I feel. They are very different languages, and very, very different cultures. And I think for me, part of the reason, and again, this is something I've only understood after years of doing it, part of the reason I like translating and I find it fulfilling is that it's a way for me to I don't want to say bridge because I find that a bit of a cliche that doesn't always work, but to kind of navigate between these two parts of my identity and my background and my biography. It's like these two languages coexist in my mind, and moving between them on the page is a way to kind of make sense of that for me.
This might take us down a rabbit hole that's just interesting to me, so I will shift away from it very quickly if needed. But is there something linguistically about Hebrew that makes it particularly interesting to work with? I mean, I understand, it's a language of like root words and, words that are built up out of a smaller group of words. Like, I'm just like intellectually, I always imagined that Hebrew could be an interesting language. Again, you don't have other languages maybe to compare it to, but like that Hebrew would seem an interesting language to work with as a translator.
It is an unusual language in some ways. And, because of its history, because of how old it is, and then how rapidly it developed, into modern Hebrew. I think that is almost unique among languages. And what I find interesting and very, very difficult about translating from Hebrew is that I like to think of Hebrew as a depth language, by which I mean there are multiple layers. So English has an enormous vocabulary. I mean, if you look at an English to Hebrew dictionary versus a Hebrew to English, it's astoundingly different, right? We have so many words for everything in English. And Hebrew does not have a huge vocabulary. And when I try to write in Hebrew, I find that very frustrating because I often feel that I can't find the word that I want to express. But so many Hebrew words have layers and layers of meaning, whether they're biblical or just other historical, cultural references that are embodied in this one word. So often I will find that I can find, 2 or 3 or even a dozen English words that will express some aspect of this one Hebrew word, but I cannot possibly find a word that will express all of the meanings and all of the allusions that it gets across.
Right.
So there's often that loss of the language.
I imagine also the sort of the kind of biblical Hebrew that's laying underneath the modern Hebrew creates interesting subtexts for certain choices that like an English reader isn't going to get necessarily.
Right. And just wild sort of swings between different registers within the same sentence. So, often in Hebrew writing, there'll be, a line of dialogue or sentence that can combine a biblical phrase with really current kind of street slang. I mean, David Grossman is particularly adept at doing that. But these don't jump out to an Israeli reader. They sound quite normal, and you hear people speaking this language every day.
Right.
But when you try to bring that into English, it often just sounds a bit ridiculous because we don't have the capacity in English to contain that sort of those extremities of different registers and make it sound natural. So that's a big challenge. Yeah.
I should have said for those watching that you can ask questions in the chat. There's a chat function underneath. I see questions already coming in. So I wanted you to also just take us through the process of translation, actually how it works, because to me it seems sort of magical, and also. You made reference earlier to sort of the potential threats to literary translation, and you didn't mention AI, but I often hear people talk recently about translators being one of the first victims of potentially AI being used more and more possibly by publishers to replace translators. So I think it'd be interesting to hear you talk about the kind of human process of going through a book and translating, sort of how you do the work, in as granular a way as you want to tell us. But I'm
okay.
I also want to ask you. I mean, we can talk generally, and then I want to ask you. We're going to specifically about 2 writers that we discussed beforehand that could be interesting to look at as examples of how it can be different. The one as opposed to the other.
Okay, so first of all, I read a book that I'm offered to translate. That's my first, which to me seems obvious, but I do know quite a few translators who don't read the book before they start translating it. Their idea being that way they're kind of going along the book as the reader would, instead of, having a bigger view of things. To me, that just seems undoable, but that is the way some translators write. So for me, I read the whole book before I even say yes. because I like to know what I'm getting into. And, some books are not right for me, or I'm not right for them. And I want to know that ahead of time. So I'll read it once. On the other end of the scale, there are translators who will read a book many, many, many times before they even sit down to translate it. And so they feel they've really assimilated it completely. For me, once is enough. I don't have time to read it more than that. So then I usually do a first draft that is quite rough. My work method has changed a little bit over the past few years, but generally what I would do is really fast first draft, which is littered with question marks and parentheses and notes and things that I have to check. And I just try not to get too held up at that stage. Because that first draft, when I finished it, that is what I view as my kind of raw material, which I then work from. And subsequent drafts, I don't really look at the original all that much, unless there's something specific that I can tell I've not done right, or I want to verify something. And this again is something that has changed. I think when I started out, I was much more faithful in the sense of the original text was to me something that I needed to stay very close to. And I had this kind of reverence towards the text and towards the writer. And that has changed over the years. I think as I've gained more experience, I just feel that the more I make the translation my own, the better it is. And that's been borne out by my experience and by the responses to my work. So I take that first draft, and then that's the book that I'm writing. I mean, I do consider myself a writer. And so then I'll usually do a second and then a third and then a fourth draft. At some point there'll be questions that I will send the writer. And that could be a handful, or it could be pages and pages about terms that are ambiguous and I need to understand what they meant, or I'll suggest different ways to approach something. So usually there's a back and forth with the author. And then in the last drafts, I'll be kind of, just refining and polishing. And the very last stage that I do, which is advice that I was given by David Grossman years ago, is to read it out loud. And specifically what he recommended, and I try to do this, is to print the translation out, which I don't do because I feel bad about the trees, but I put it on my Kindle and I use a different font, some kind of unusual font, so that just looks different than what you've been seeing all this time. And to go to a different place that is not your office. I mean, I think David said, go out into the mountains, which he can do right outside his doorstep. I can't necessarily do that. And then read it out loud. And it's really amazing how many things you catch when you read a text out loud, even if you see it on the screen or on the page, 50 times. So that's really the last stage of kind of polishing. And that's where you want to make sure that you have the same kind of musicality that the original has, because that's important to a lot of writers. I think to the good writers, that is how something sounds.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, the reading aloud is always good advice, in any kind of writing. Definitely. I'm curious sort of, okay, so there's the questions that you go back to the writer with, but then there is this domain of decisions, right, that you give yourself license to make, interpretive decisions about which word to choose or a certain kind of syntax. So like, where do you draw the line for yourself in terms of sort of how much liberty you take versus where you really feel like the writer needs to weigh in? And I imagine that this is dependent on the situation, but generally speaking.
Yeah, it does depend on the specific writer and sometimes on the specific book. I take quite a bit of freedom. I would say, especially when it comes to dialogue. And so we're talking, I mostly translate fiction, right? And I do occasionally do nonfiction, and then the things are a little different there, but let's focus on fiction. With dialogue in particular, it has to sound believable. And sometimes that means straying quite far from the original. I try not to go too far. I'm not changing things, certainly not without consulting with the author. But yeah, I want the reader to be able to hear these characters and believe that they're real people. and just the way they would in the original. And so I do take quite a lot of liberties. And there are times when an author has said, this isn't working, this isn't quite what I mean. And I've very rarely, if ever, had a real disagreement. But sometimes there'll be a push and pull, and the author might feel that I've gone too far. I think what happens is that authors who've never been translated before, they are the most resistant to any liberties that I want to take, because they're anxious, and it's their baby that they're giving over to me, and they don't want me to mangle the baby. And so I tend to find that when it's the first book they're having translated, there's a bit more of a resistance to what I want to do, but I usually kind of win them over.
You also have the challenge that most of these Israeli authors are going to be quite proficient in English. I mean, I've had the experience talking with David Grossman and wondering why his English is so much better than mine. So
well, I mean, and that can be a double-edged sword, right? Because, well, first of all Israelis think their English is excellent.
Right.
Among those who really do have good English, it can be, on the one hand, it's very helpful for me because we can really have in-depth discussions about a word, a term, and they can really weigh in on that. On the other hand, it means that I'm subjected to a lot more scrutiny than the person who's translating it into Korean, because how many really read to speak Korean? So it goes both ways. But on the whole, I do enjoy working with writers whose English is good, because this is more of a dialogue.
No, I've had my own books translated into Chinese and Romanian, and I have
that's just blind faith, right? You have to,
Right. You mentioned something at first when you started talking about the process about your you need to have a certain kind of feeling about the book. Like, do you need to like the book that you're translating? Does it need to be something that you connect with personally?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is, I certainly don't have to love every book. If I really dislike it, I couldn't do a good job of it. And I wouldn't want to spend many, many months of my life with a text that I don't like. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think it's good. Sometimes I get offered things that are really good in terms of the writing, the craft. I can see the talent, I can see the quality, but they don't speak to me. They're not a style that I like, or the subject matter doesn't, So I need to have some connection with a book. Because that's how I can do a good translation, is if I feel that in some way I could have written that book if I were a writer.
Interesting. And there is, because you do have a range of kind of stylistic choices on the part of the authors who you're translating. I mean, an Etgar Keret and David Grossman are, working in very different registers. Well, let's talk about them specifically, because I'm curious to hear.
Okay. Although I do have things to say about AI as well, if you want to get back to that later.
Oh, I would definitely want to talk about AI. Yeah. So you mentioned when we talked before about an interesting process that David Grossman has that sounds fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So David Grossman, for the past 3 books that he's written, he has convened a group of his translators for a kind of seminar that lasts 3 to 4 days. I think in one case it was almost a week. And it's not, he gets translated into, I think, over 40 languages. So it's not all of us, but there's kind of a core group of his translators who've been at these seminars with him, and who are all translating the same book into their respective languages. And we will gather twice. It's been at a literary translation center in Germany. And then the last time we did it for More Than I Love My Life, which is his latest book that came out in English, we actually met in Croatia, which is where parts of the book take place.
Right, that's right.
So it's we meet there, and the kind of format of what we do is we sit in a meeting room, and David reads the whole book to us in Hebrew out loud. And every time there's something that we have a question about, that one of the translators have a question about, we'll stop him and we'll ask, and sometimes we get into discussions that end up taking the whole rest of the session. If he has something he wants to emphasize or explain, he will stop and tell us what he thinks we need to know about it. And there's a lot of interaction, among the translators. We've also built up this really amazing kind of, fraternity of translators almost. We have a WhatsApp group that we keep going all the time. It often happens that 2 or 3 of us are working on another writer's book at the same time. And it's interesting to see how, even though we're all doing different languages, we can use each other's solutions sometimes to reach our own solutions. And David has said, after he did this for the first time, which I actually wasn't physically at because I had just given birth and couldn't travel. This was in the days before Zoom, but I think I Skyped in. But he has said that he wants to do this every time he has a book that's been translated because it's so valuable. I think in some sense it's just makes things easier practically, because instead of answering pretty much the same questions over and over again for each translator over email or whatever, he gets to do it all at once and kind of make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand what his priorities are. It's just an amazing experience and quite an unusual one. I mean, my translator friends are always very curious and jealous about this because very few translators get to do this.
Do questions come up, from other languages that you're sort of surprised by because they're not like the same sort of issues that you might have?
Yes, definitely. Both in terms of the things that pose difficulties for the different languages. There are some things that, all or most of us will find difficult and just say, oh yeah, this is a massive headache. But sometimes there are things that I didn't even stop to think about when I was translating, but for, Spanish or whatever other language, they're an issue because of some other cultural reference that it brings up in their language or lack of reference they have. So yeah, it's been really interesting to see how different languages require different solutions, and even kind of formal things. I remember we once I forget which book this was about, but in English translation, it's considered really not done to have footnotes in fiction, about fiction. It's something that we avoid doing at all costs. I mean, I've translated 30-some books, and I don't think I've ever used a single footnote that wasn't there in the original, So I'm talking about, explaining terms. And every so often a writer will say, well, why don't you just explain this in a footnote? And I'm just like, no. Wait, couldn't possibly. That's cheating. That's taking the easy way out. And so we were in one of these groups talking about a term, and again, I don't remember which one it was. And the author said to the French translator, well, how are you going to handle this? And he said, oh, I'm putting a footnote. And there was this audible gasp in the room, like, what? How? And he's like, yeah, French novels are full of footnotes. No one thinks twice about it. It's completely acceptable. Right. So, different cultures and different readers have different expectations for what's legitimate and what isn't.
Right. And now tell us about Edgar Keret, the very, very short story writer.
Yeah. So Edgar, who many people know, he's hugely successful in English and in lots of languages all over Europe, South America. He writes very short fiction. And for the past almost 3 years now, he's been writing a Substack newsletter that comes out. When we first started out, it was 3 times a week. Then we went down to twice. Now it's down to once a week. Okay. And I've been working with him right from the start. So he writes the pieces in Hebrew and he sends them to me for translation. And then, the posts come out once a week. And it's some of it, I'd say most of it is fiction, is short stories, but there's also quite a lot of personal essays type, I would say, some commentary on things that are going on in Israel or personal stories from his life, some of his ideas about writing and tips, things like that. And because of the short turnaround time and the way that he's kind of constantly writing and sending things out, I don't usually get the kind of finished, printed, polished piece that I would normally be working from on a translation. He sends me essentially a draft. I mean, it's a pretty final draft, but it's not set in stone. and then I do my translation, and based on that translation, he will then modify some things, or I'll say, this isn't really working, and we won't just change it in English, we'll actually change the original. So it's been this very collaborative way of working, which is new to me and to him, I think.
Right.
But it's really fun.
And quicker, it sounds like it has to be sort of.
Yeah.
Actually, which reminds me, I wanted to ask you just about how much time all of this takes. Like, I mean, is there, if you've been able to quantify for yourself over the years, like, I mean, I suppose it changes with each author you're working with and the level of difficulty, but like, how much time does it take to translate, a page or a book for you?
It does change a lot depending on the author and the style. And these days I very rarely am able to be working on just one project at a time, because I just have so many things going on. So for most, let's say for the average length novel that's, say, 250, 300 pages, if I were working just on that, I would probably at this point be able to do it in maybe 4 months, 5 months. In reality, I usually take 6 months, even a year. There's one novel that I'm working on now that I've been working on for the past 3 years, and not even close to being done.
Really?
Mostly because it's very, very difficult and dense and complex prose, but also because it kind of keeps getting pushed to the bottom of my list because of other things that come up.
Right.
So yeah, it varies a lot.
Right. You mentioned AI, so have at it. What should we be worried?
Yeah.
Or should you be worried?
I'm worried.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of conversations about this with people over the last, particularly, since ChatGPT came out, which was a year and a half ago or so. I've talked to translators, many of whom are not worried enough, I think. But then I'm a worrier, so no one's worried enough in my book. But I've talked to tech people in Israel and here. The consensus is that even today, for someone who's translating, sort of genre fiction, so pretty, straightforward prose from Spanish, German, French, the sort of quote unquote major languages, they can already be replaced. AI is good enough. Yeah. With perhaps a human editor to go over it.
Even like novels, or we're talking about sort of,
like airport novels.
Airport novels, right?
So if you're talking about literary fiction and things where there's much more complex or original or unusual prose, it's not quite there. And in particular for a language like Hebrew, where there just isn't the same size of corpus that the machine learned from, it's also not there. But I have to say that I've been astounded by how well even ChatGPT, which isn't particularly, the right tool for literature, even that can do a really good job of some things. And by really good job, I mean, it writes well. You read the text and it seems smooth and fluent and even quite elegant in some parts. When you actually sit down and compare it to the original, you find a lot of flaws because, it hallucinates and it makes things up and it gets things wrong.
Right.
But the truth is, publishing is a really difficult industry. Most publishers do not make money. I mean, I'm talking particularly small indie presses, and that's mostly who publishes literary fiction and translation. And so I could see a publisher thinking, well, if these translations are going to be good enough for readers, which they will for most readers, why would I pay, thousands and thousands of dollars to a human translator when I can get this done for free? So I am worried about where that's going to go.
That does seem particularly true if we're talking about, work where the quality of language is not the thing that is the most important, but it's
exactly
audit or but when you look at an AI production, besides the glitchiness and the weird things where it's because that's going to eventually become ironed out. Like, do you see where it differs from a human's ability to make those interpretive choices that you make that make what you do akin to writing?
I do. There's something flat and kind of soulless about it. I was actually reading an essay a while ago that talked about how, I mean, AI could make mistakes in the sense that it doesn't get the right thing, but it doesn't make mistakes in the way that we humans make mistakes, where we try something and it doesn't work out, and we try it again and we come at it from a different angle. And that process, I think, is a lot of what makes writing interesting. And you can kind of sense that trial and error and the struggle in the prose. I think I like to read things where you have this sense of, the writer doesn't know everything and it's not smooth. And they're coming at things from different angles. You're not going to find that in a machine translation.
Yeah.
So,
in some ways, it's our sort of it's our limitedness that sort of allows creativity to actually work.
I think so.
We have to make choices. I wanted to ask you too, we're obviously speaking in a certain political context at the moment in this pre-October 7th, post-October 7th, sorry, world. And, I'm curious, first of all, just sort of how you've seen it affect. Israel is obviously becoming increasingly isolated. And I want to know sort of what it's meant from your perspective in just the publishing world, and in terms of Israeli authors being translated or published here, work that's coming or not coming your way. Like, how has it rocked your particular world?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a good situation in any way. There's definitely been an impact in literature, and obviously in the wider cultural and artistic world. And I'm sure everyone here has read about exhibitions being cancelled, people being uninvited from things, research collaborations ending, all that kind of stuff. And in publishing too, what's happening, at least from what I'm hearing, there are a lot of American and European authors who no longer want to be published in Israel, and who are going so far as to have their books taken off the shelves there, or back out of contracts for translation into Hebrew. So that's happening quite a bit.
And was, from my understanding, already beginning to happen before
October 7th, I think a little bit.
Maybe I remember like Alice Water.
That's
Alice
true.
Water, they were,
Yeah. That was happening a little bit, but I think it wasn't happening often, and that's why the few cases made a lot of headlines.
Right.
But yeah, now it's very, very widespread. And as far as going in the opposite direction, there definitely is a huge reluctance now on the part of editors to even look at submissions from Israeli writers. And I've not been told explicitly by anyone, I won't read this. But I feel like this is not a good time to pitch an Israeli writer, because I do have things that I'm translating or will be translating that don't have a publisher yet, and I often find myself functioning as a kind of agent, and I'm just not really doing that now. And I actually think that a lot of the editors and publishers who are not interested in publishing Israeli writers, it's not because they themselves are necessarily sort of anti-Israel.
Right.
But they see which way the wind is blowing, and they don't want to take on something that's going to get them, in trouble with protesters and boycotts. It's not, business-wise, it's not a good decision. And in some ways I can understand that. And there still are publishers who, things are coming out, Israeli writers are being published, but it's becoming a more difficult and hostile environment, definitely. And I've been lucky enough to I haven't had any work cancelled. I'm still really, really busy. I'm, about to sign a contract that will keep me booked up through the end of 2025. And so I think that, this is true for sort of BDS and political stuff, but also for AI. I think that there'll be a small handful of translators like me in Hebrew and in other languages who will survive this. But there may be some who just won't be able to get enough work. And, that depends on what happens.
Right. So, I mean, for you personally, the notion of Hebrew becoming a kind of or Israeli writers becoming a kind of a toxic language, or a toxic sort of place from which to read writers from, I mean, one hopes that it doesn't affect you personally, but like you're not worried at the moment, is what you're saying.
I'm worried, but I don't really feel it affecting me directly now. And I also really feel like I should say that while this is very much on my mind and on our mind at this kind of event, I have to say that, all of this pales in comparison to what actual people are going through, both in Israel and in Gaza. So part of me feels like this is nothing compared to the loss of life.
Right.
We'll all survive this.
But it does sort of, and this is actually going to be my last question because we have so many great questions in the chat. So, but I guess the bigger question I have is sort of what will be lost if American or English readers don't have access to the work of Israeli writers. And because part of what's happening now, it seems to me, is a kind of a well, I won't say what I think.
No, you can.
No. I just think there's a lot of kind of dehumanization happening on both sides everywhere,
Yeah.
and those are the things that obviously cut through that. But I don't want to take your answer away from you. I'm curious what you think about that.
I agree with that. That's kind of what I was going to say. So much of the discourse now is so one-sided on both sides, and really lacking in complexity and nuance and sort of in a multi-dimensional view of things. And to me, fiction, reading good literature is a way to combat that, to sort of open the reader's mind to the possibility of other perspectives. And, you can't be a good writer, or I think a good reader, without empathy, without the desire and the capacity to imagine your life being different, to imagine your place in the world being different. And that's what fiction does. It allows you to do that. And so I think that some of the people who are, making very stridently sort of black or white, one-sided statements could probably stand to read more literature. And even just in terms of, finding out what Israel really is. Because it is a very multidimensional, very colorful, very complex place. As most countries are, but since it's a place that's in the news all the time and people seem to think they know everything about it, I think they could learn a lot by reading literature that's written there or takes place there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's turn to some questions. The challenge of humor and translating humor, and I think this is from somebody named Kalai. I'm curious sort of how you handle that, in particular in Grossman's book, which is, for those of you who haven't read it, is both an amazing book and an amazing feat of translation, I have to say, is entirely told from the point of view of a stand-up comedian. Who's speaking in a very particular context to a very particular audience, and jokes are so, they work because of their specificity, so I'm curious what do you do with that as a translator? How do you make it work? We were talking before about how much leeway I take and how much liberty. That humor is probably the area where I have to take the most liberty, because you can very rarely translate a joke into the same joke in a different language and have it work. Yeah. So there's a lot of adaptation that needs to be done. Yeah. And with that book, A Horse Walks into a Bar, that was, the book that obviously most sort of expressly is both about and told in humor. But really, I think every single book I've translated has some element of humor in it, because Israelis are funny and sarcastic, and there's a lot of black humor that works its way into, pretty much every literary or cultural output. So it's something I come across a lot. It's hard for me to even give a rule of thumb for how I do it, because it's such a case by case thing. But in that book, I definitely did do probably the most radical changes that I've done. And with David, there were cases where I said to him, I can't make this joke work. I just can't find an equivalent. But right. This bit on the next page that isn't funny in the original, I have a good idea for, a word play or a pun or something that will make it funny here. So can we compensate? So that's the kind of thing
that
So
I did.
you'd have to write jokes essentially.
Yeah. And yeah, and he did that kind of research too. He watched a lot of stand-up and sort of became a joke writer to write the book. And then sometimes we had to drop things because, you know, if you try to force something, especially a joke, it's just not going to work. So you have to have these things sound natural. But yeah, that is a fun and very challenging thing to translate.
A question from Dan Friedman. He says, is there an old adversary, a word or a phrase that you see in a Hebrew book and your heart either sinks or jumps knowing you have to translate it anew?
Yes, I actually have a running list that I've been keeping for probably 20 years now of impossible words to translate. And there's quite a few things there. I'm trying to think. I mean, some of them are kind of the obvious, like chutzpah and, you know, things that we use in English, but I don't always want to have that kind of Borscht Belt tone to a book, so I try to find something else. There's military terms. So I think the two things that appear in almost every book I've ever translated are humor and the army. Even if in a book that has nothing to do with the army, ostensibly, there's always going to be some acronym that everyone in Israel knows.
In Hebrew, right? Like Bagatz and that are like,
And everyone knows these things. I mean, I didn't serve in the army, and I know them because they're just part of language, and those are very difficult to translate because here, you know, in the States, we just don't have that sort of seeping in of military language into regular English. It's very rare that we have this, so that's difficult. There's also a couple of words that are not in and of themselves difficult to translate, but they're overused in Hebrew. And I've talked about this with some of my colleagues, other Hebrew translators I'm friendly with, and we all know these few words. So for some reason that none of us have ever been able to explain, Hebrew writing often includes the word pitom, which means suddenly. Very straightforward. It's not difficult to translate.
Right.
But it's always in there when it doesn't need to be.
It's like a transition word?
It's just like they'll start a sentence and say, you know, suddenly he got up and said, let's go to lunch. And when you don't need the suddenly, it's like this false sense of sort of tension or I don't know. So some words I just consider them fillers, and I just don't even bother putting them in.
Everything in Israel is done suddenly. That's the
it's a very dramatic place.
A few people wanted to know whether you also translate from English to Hebrew, and if you've ever done that or tried to do it, what that experience has been like.
I used to translate into Hebrew when I did technical stuff, and it took me longer. And I was less confident about it. So I've never done that for literature. I think because I read so much in English, my English writing has always been much better. I actually recently had the experience of trying to write kind of an essay, let's say personal essay type piece in Hebrew for publication. And I struggled and gave up because I don't feel that I have that facility. I don't have, I struggle too much to find the right words. I become frustrated because I know how to say this in English and it doesn't quite come out the right way in Hebrew. There's some part of my brain, the writing part, that doesn't seem to work as well in Hebrew.
Right. And that's often the case, right? With translators that like this,
They are the dominant language,
Interesting question from Salvador Villalever. Do you study the work of other translators? Do translators have their own style? For example, if you were to read an original text in Hebrew and then a translation without knowing who did it, would you have an idea of who the translator was based on their style?
Oh, so other translators of Hebrew.
I guess that's what that means. Yeah.
I do read other translations. I mean, not a lot, because with Hebrew books, I prefer to read them in the original, but I have often, either when I've been reviewing a book or sometimes evaluating a translation, I have read some of my colleagues' translations. I don't know that I could identify them, but that doesn't mean it's not true that each translator has their style, because they do. I don't think I've read enough and closely enough to to be able to say. But yeah, a translator, I think there's this kind of fallacy that a translator is or should be invisible, and that nothing of the translation should be in the book. And that's not, first of all, it's impossible. And I also don't think it's desirable. I think readers just need to kind of acknowledge that they're reading the work of two writers, the original one and the translator. Right. So yeah, in translator leave their print on a book for sure.
Do you think, this is a question for me now, but do you think that, I mean, we talked about AI and we talked about the specific case of Israel and it becoming harder, but do you think in general over the course of your own career that literary translation has gotten more respect, and with the, seeing the names of translators on covers and awards for translation, it seems to me standing on the side that it has, but I don't know if that's been your I'm curious.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I think we still have a long way to go, but we have made a lot of progress. I've been quite active for a number of years in a couple of different translators organizations and doing translator advocacy and trying to kind of increase the visibility of translators. Because there was always this attitude, I think, from the part of publishers who claimed that readers didn't want to know that they were reading a translation because it would somehow put them, which I've never believed.
No.
And that's really changing a lot. As you mentioned, more translators are getting their names on the cover. There's been big campaigns about that. That's not necessarily my kind of big thing, but I think it reflects a growing appreciation for translators and a recognition that they're doing important work and contributing to the
Is that a negotiate? How is that decision made about whether a translator gets room on a cover? Is it like individual publishers or translators who make it part of their deal, or?
There are some there are some publishers who will who will always put the translator's name on the cover. That's standard practice. For most, they don't like to and will resist it, and then it's up to the translator, how much they want to push when negotiating a contract.
Right. Another question here from Deborah. I says, I'm wondering if there are books that you loved and have translated or wanted to translate and couldn't find a publisher for, and what happens to these books? If there have been times when it has taken years for a translation that you love to finally find a publisher.
Yeah, definitely. I have quite a few books that I've translated in their entirety, but mostly because, the author might have won an award that came with money for translation, or there was some other funding source. And these books are languishing in my computer and haven't been published. In some cases, as I mentioned before, it's because there isn't an agent. And so I'm kind of thrust into that role, which I don't particularly enjoy, and I'm not very good at because, I found it very difficult to place things. Sometimes there are agents, and for whatever reason, even though it's a good book, publishers are reluctant. Sometimes I think if they feel a book is too unusual and doesn't fit neatly into a category, American publishers in particular tend to be wary of that because they don't know how to sell it.
Right.
So I have this kind of few books that every so often I get re-energized and I try to send them out again, and so I never give up on a book. I hope they'll all eventually come out, but it does happen.
A question from Joe Lowen says, can you talk about translating Noe Edlin, whom you've worked on her book? He's asking, how would you handle, for example, her Sefer Alonachon, which has a whole chapter of English transliterated into Hebrew?
Right.
So I don't know that's the case.
It's a great book. And that book.
He's also asking about Hila. Did you translate Hila Bloom's?
No. So we'll answer that bit first. So Hila Bloom has a book called How to Love Your Daughter, which actually is out. It was translated by Daniela Zamil, who's a good friend of mine, and she did a great job. So that book came out, it's been about a year ago. For Noe Edlin, her book Stockholm, which I translated, came out in November, which was an unfortunate time for an Israeli to come out. So it got a little bit lost, and we're trying to kind of give it another push. I think there's going to be a paperback in a few months, and so that will hopefully give us a chance to get her back in, because it's a great book. She's For those of you who don't know her, she used to be a journalist, but she's been a novelist for a long time. She's very, very funny. I mean, she's one of the funniest people I know, and also her writing is very funny, but also very insightful and smart. And so Stockholm is out. The other book that the questioner mentioned, Sefer Olonchon, which means the wrong book, that has been translated by Yarden Greenspan, who's also a fantastic translator. You know well. And we're hoping that it gets published. That's an example of a book that's just waiting for a publisher, and we're hoping that the same publisher who did Stockholm picks that up, but we'll wait and see.
I like the idea of the chapter transliterated into.
Yeah, I don't know what she did with that. I haven't read her translation, but I'm sure she found some creative solution.
Have you ever translated Arab Israeli writers?
I've translated not a whole book. I've done some short pieces by Sayed Kashua. And I don't know if I've done any others. No, I mean, I would like to. There's some great stuff that's been written. And some of it has come out in other translations. Yeah.
What about poetry? Have you translated poetry?
No, thank you.
Oh, really? Okay. Tell us why.
No, I mean, I've just, there's a really, really big difference between translating prose and poetry. And I discovered very early on that I don't have the sensibility and the kind of ability to play with language that a poet needs. Once in a while, I have done some poetry, and I always end up feeling that it's not what I should be doing, and I just don't have the skills for it. So I try to avoid that. I've done some of my prose writers will dabble in poetry, and then I end up having to follow them into that, but it doesn't happen very often.
Okay, we're nearing the end. One more question here. I'm going to read it. There's a question that I'm going to tag on my own ask too. It says, do you have suggestions on how to introduce translated works to a wider audience? And then I'm also curious if there are books, selfishly, I'm curious if there are books of Israeli authors who we don't know about here, who we should know about, people who you particularly love, just sort of what you're, you can share lots of recommendations, or books that have been translated that you think are particularly worth people picking up in this moment.
Okay. Well, I'll do the first part first. Yes. Although I don't know that I have a very brilliant answer to that. I personally think that translated literature should not be kind of set aside in its own world. I mean, good writing is good writing, no matter which language it was originally written in. So, although there are bookstores that have translated sections, and I do like seeing that, I think it would be better to have, novels together. Doesn't matter if they're translated or not. And I think that would go a long way towards having readers, more open to reading things if they see them on the same shelf as an American writer. That's my take. But really also it's about getting more stuff published, and publishers to not view translation as such a risky thing. And there are reasons why it is, obviously, because it's more difficult for them to evaluate a manuscript when they can't read it.
Right.
But there are ways to get around it.
Right.
And as for your question about specific writers, well, there's a writer of mine who I really love, and we published New Vessel Press, which is a great publisher of almost exclusively translated fiction. They published this writer. His name is Abu Shif, and his novel is called Professor Schiff's Guilt. Okay. So the main character of the novel is kind of an alter ego of the author, and it came out about a year ago, and it's a really great novel. It's quite political. It's kind of satirical. He's one of very, very few Israeli writers who writes political satire, which to me is always surprising because there is so much.
So much to satirize.
So I would love it if more readers found his book.
Yeah.
And then another writer who I just think is incredible, really one of the most original and talented writers in Israel, is Dror Burstein.
Okay.
Yes. I actually have not translated him, but he's got quite a few things out in really good translations.
Okay.
He's not, he's not the most, it's not commercial. It's not like an easy read, but it's also not particularly dense or challenging. It's very thought provoking and often really beautiful writing. He's just got a lovely way of telling a story and working with language. So I would look for him. And then a writer we haven't mentioned who is getting good press, but I'll give her some more, is Maya Arad.
I was gonna mention her too. I mean, that to me, that's an example of how important translation is, because she's a writer who I hadn't really had a chance to read yet, and this is her first book translated into English.
Yeah.
It was such a revelation to be able to actually to read her and read stories about. I mean, she writes about this particular collection is about Israelis in America. Spoke to me personally, but I felt like, just a light was turned on.
Yeah. She's a great writer, and she's written I think about a dozen works of fiction, all of which have been bestsellers in Israel. I mean, she's hugely popular there, critically and among readers. And this is the first book of hers in English. And yeah, she does a lot of her books are about Israeli expats in the US. Because she herself is an expat. She's lived in California for most of her adult life, and that's where she's done all of her writing in Hebrew. So she's an interesting case. And yeah, The Hebrew Teacher just came out in my translation last month. So, and there's another book, then this is again the same publisher. I'll give another plug for New Vessel.
Right.
And they're also bringing out her next book in English.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. This was a lot of fun to be able to talk to you. And like I said, I've been a longtime fan, because the books that we're able to read in English because of you are just, it provides such riches. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and it's been a great conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Jessica and Gal, for sharing your insights from AI to how tough it is for Israeli writers right now to stand-up comedy, something for everybody. So thank you to everybody who joined us here today, and thank you for a successful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.